waking up underground, with each breath reduced to a strangled rasp inside a narrow wooden box, is humanity's most primal nightmare. But for our protagonist, this was only the beginning. When fury overcame fear, he clawed his way back from the edge of death with a cruel plan in mind. Yet the line between vengeance and atrocity is perilously thin. A twisted spiritual prank, a catastrophic misunderstanding, and the price paid was the life of someone entirely innocent. If you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do here. We upload new stories several times a week. So if that's of interest to you, please hit the subscribe button and turn on all notifications. Also, please gently sneak into the like button's house, take all the batteries out of their TV remote, and hide them in the back of the freezer. Then, just casually walk out of the front door like nothing ever happened. Now, let's get into today's stories. On a summer morning in 1876, Dr. Lewis Allard was walking down the corridor of a hospital in Papeete, Tahiti, an island east of Australia. He was just about to step into his office when he heard the hospital doors open. Turning around, he saw several police officers entering, carrying an unconscious man on a stretcher. From the man's clothing alone, Dr. Allard could tell he was a sailor. Many of Dr. Allard's patients were sailors, since Papeete was a port town. If someone fell ill or was injured at sea and docked in Papeete, they would come straight to this hospital. Dr. Allard approached the officers and asked what had happened to the sailor. They explained that the man's friends had found him unresponsive that morning, apparently after a long night of drinking. Dr. Allard nodded and motioned for the officers to follow him with the stretcher. He led them to an examination room, where they placed the sailor on a table so he could be examined. The sailor looked quite young, around 20 years old, and appeared strong and healthy. But when Dr. Allard checked his pulse, there was none. He checked again, and then again, to make sure it was not simply faint. Finally, he concluded that the sailor was not merely unconscious, he was dead. And if Dr. Allard had to guess, the cause was likely alcohol poisoning, given that the man's friends said he had drunk heavily the night before. The hospital had a policy for handling the deaths of foreign sailors in Tahiti. Essentially, once a doctor declared a sailor dead, arrangements were made to bury him in the public cemetery. In fact, the hospital kept cheap wooden coffins in the morgue for precisely this purpose. So Dr. Allard followed procedure. He asked the police to inform the sailor's friends of his death, then went to the hospital morgue to arrange for a coffin. A few hours later, Dr. Allard was in his office when he heard a knock at the door. He told whoever it was to come in, but when the door opened, he was surprised to see 4 local gravediggers, the same men he had hired earlier to bury the sailor. Normally, Dr. Allard had almost no interaction with gravediggers after hiring them. He would tell them to bury the body. They would do it, and that was the end of it. There was no reason for them to come back and speak to him. But as he looked at the 4 men standing there, clearly uneasy, he immediately sensed they were not here for casual conversation. They looked terrified. Before Dr. Allard could ask a single question, one of the gravediggers began speaking. In a rushed, anxious voice, the man said that as they were carrying the coffin toward the burial site, it began to shake, as if the person inside were still alive. Then they heard groaning coming from inside the sealed, nailed coffin. They had been so frightened that they dropped it and ran straight back to the hospital to tell the doctor. Dr. Allard was taken aback by what he was hearing, but he also remembered that when he hired these 4 men, they had been drinking at a local tavern. So he reasoned that either something strange had happened with the coffin, or, more likely, the men were drunk and imagining things. Irritated, Dr. Allard told them that the man was dead. This was not some demonic scenario. Still, if they were that concerned, they could fetch a police officer to inspect the coffin, confirm that the man inside was indeed dead, and then return to finish their job. The gravediggers exchanged uncomfortable glances and said they would do exactly that. They turned and left. Dr. Allard went back to his work. Several hours later, he heard another knock at the door. This time, when it opened, a police officer stood there, the same officer the gravediggers had been sent to find. The officer explained that he had checked the coffin. It had not moved. There were no strange sounds. It was sealed tight, nothing unusual at all. So he had ordered the grave diggers to proceed with the burial. There was nothing to see here. The officer was simply informing Dr. Allard that everything was fine. The sailor had been buried. Life could go on. About a week later, Dr. Allard had all but forgotten the strange episode surrounding the coffin. He had moved on to other matters. One evening, as was his habit, he went out for a walk. The place he most enjoyed walking was the cemetery. Not out of any morbid fascination, but because it was usually empty and quiet. It was peaceful. He was strolling through the cemetery as usual, seeing no one, as usual. But as dusk deepened, he was walking between rows of headstones when he glanced ahead and thought he saw someone standing behind a tree, partially exposed, partially hidden, half obscured by the trunk. He stopped and stared. Something felt wrong. What was this person doing here? Was it even a person? And as he watched, the figure stepped out from behind the tree. The way it moved, stepping fully into view, turning to face him, and then standing still, made it unmistakably clear that it was staring directly at Dr. Allard. The figure was still some distance away, but immediately Dr. Allard felt threatened. He could not tell if this was a man or something else entirely. He could not tell if his mind was playing tricks on him. All he knew was that this thing was watching him. Now, uneasy, Dr. Allard instinctively turned and began to walk away. His evening stroll was over, but after only a few steps, the hair on the back of his neck stood on end. He felt certain that whoever, or whatever, this was, it was still watching him. He stopped and turned around. The figure was now moving straight toward him. It was almost running, advancing rapidly across the cemetery. Dr. Allard panicked. Something was terribly wrong. Why was this happening? Was this even a person? He turned and ran. As he ran, a piercing, horrific scream echoed across the cemetery. Dr. Allard glanced back one last time and saw the face of the figure charging toward him. It was the same man who had died a week earlier, the same sailor he had buried, the man who had supposedly moved inside his coffin and terrified the gravediggers. It was him. The sailor lunged at Dr. Allard and began strangling him. Dr. Allard fell to the ground, staring up at that horrifying face as the screams poured out of it. He had no idea what was happening. Then he lost consciousness. A few minutes later, Dr. Allard came to. He jolted upright and looked around. There was no one there. Only the dark, empty cemetery. No sign of the dead sailor. No sign of anyone or anything. They were gone. Dr. Allard sat there, his heart pounding. He asked himself, did that really just happen? It felt real. His neck ached where he had been attacked, and he was certain of what he had seen. The face had belonged to the sailor. But how could that be? The man was dead. He had been buried. Eventually, Dr. Allard got up and hurried home. But in the weeks that followed, he began to unravel. Almost every day, at any moment, he would catch a glimpse out of the corner of his eye. Just a flash of the dead sailor's face. It was always the same face, twisted, screaming, staring straight at him. Whenever he turned to look, it would vanish. But Dr. Allard felt haunted. Something had happened in that cemetery. It had been real. He believed the sailor's ghost was now following him. Yet he could not tell anyone. He was a doctor. What was he supposed to say? That a ghost was tormenting him. After a few weeks, he stopped leaving his house altogether, staying in bed and pretending to be ill. He lay there with his eyes closed most of the day, because the moment he opened them, he would see the sailor's face. He was losing his mind. Eventually, Dr. Allard knew he could not remain in bed forever. He had to return to the hospital, re-enter society, resume his work, or people would start asking questions. When that moment came, he climbed up onto the roof of his house and threw himself off. He could not live with what he believed was a ghost haunting him day and night. When Dr. Allard's close friends learned that he had taken his own life, they went straight to the police. They told them, wait, we think this has something to do with what he'd been dealing with over the past few weeks. Although Dr. Allard had not wanted to talk openly about his ordeal, he had confided in a few close friends. He told them again and again that he kept seeing the dead sailor's face everywhere he went. These friends had seen his mental state deteriorate, all centered on the sailor. They told the police, we know this sounds far-fetched, but the doctor believed he was being haunted by the dead sailor before he died. We think it's connected to why he killed himself. Surprisingly, the police took this seriously. They said, "All right, we'll look into it." And what they did was exhume the sailor's coffin. They didn't know what else to do. When they lifted the coffin out of the ground and opened it, they could hardly believe what they saw. It turned out the 4 gravediggers had every reason to be terrified of what they thought they heard and felt inside that coffin. Because the sailor had not been dead, he had been so drunk that he appeared lifeless. His pulse was undetectable. Dr. Allard had been wrong. The sailor was alive. As he was being carried toward the grave, he had been moving inside the coffin, groaning in his stupor, fully alive but trapped, likely not even understanding what was happening. The gravediggers had been right to panic. They had fetched a police officer. The officer arrived, inspected the coffin, and for whatever reason, found it sealed, motionless, silent. The sailor inside did not move or make a sound at that moment, and so the officer allowed the burial to proceed. The living sailor was buried underground. The gravediggers went their separate ways. But later, the sailor regained full consciousness. He began struggling beneath the earth. He broke through the coffin and clawed his way out of the ground. He saved himself. He survived being buried alive. And he was furious with the doctor who had carelessly declared him dead and had him buried. So he decided to take revenge. He filled his coffin with rocks, sealed it again, and reburied it so no one would suspect a thing. Over the next week, he hid, telling no one that he was still alive. He knew that the doctor often walked through the cemetery at night. So he hid behind a tree and waited for Dr. Allard to come along. And when he saw him, it was the very real, living sailor who stepped out from behind that tree and stared at the doctor. He ran forward, screaming, pretending to be a ghost. He attacked Dr. Allard, making him believe he was being assaulted by an enraged spirit. When the doctor collapsed unconscious on the ground, the sailor fled. But for Dr. Allard, who fully believed the sailor was dead, you can imagine what it meant to be attacked by him in the cemetery. He believed, without question, that it was the sailor's ghost. He had a completely real experience of being assaulted by a dead man. Although he survived the encounter, it destroyed him. He began seeing the sailor's ghost everywhere he went, until it ultimately drove him to end his own life. When the police opened the coffin, all they found were the stones the sailor had left behind. After the doctor's death, the sailor quietly left the town and was never seen again. What is more terrifying, a horrific nightmare, or the realization that the nightmare is repeating itself detail for detail in broad daylight? You fall into a deep sleep after an exhausting shift, and suddenly you find yourself standing in the midst of the most violent storm you have ever witnessed. The raindrops are no longer water. They slam down like shards of broken glass, embedding themselves into your skin with searing pain. In the pitch-black night over Lake Superior, a strange man appears through the curtain of rain, dressed in attire so elegant it feels grotesquely out of place. He staggers toward you without saying a word, grips your hand tightly, and shakes it with desperate force, before pointing toward the raging surface of a lake, as if warning you about something monstrous lurking beneath it. You wake up drenched in sweat, your heart pounding as if it might burst from your chest, and you tell yourself it was only a dream. But what happens if, just hours later, the same cold hand from that nightmare grips yours again in real life? At the exact moment the man exhales his final breath beneath the freezing water. This story takes us back to the night of August 30th, 1892, at the Deer Park Life-Saving Station, a predecessor of the United States Coast Guard, tucked along the unforgiving shores of Lake Superior in Michigan. Our main character is Benjamin Trudel, a 20-year-old young man brimming with energy, working as a surfman. Elite lifesavers tasked with patrolling the coastline and responding to shipwrecks. That night, Benjamin had just completed a grueling 4-hour patrol across soggy, shifting sands. As the clock edged into the early morning hours, he was granted a brief period of rest before his next watch. He climbed onto the station's narrow bed, exchanged a few words with his fellow surfmen, and quickly drifted off to sleep. But it was not a peaceful sleep. Benjamin found himself walking along the familiar shoreline, but the world around him had transformed into something out of hell. A violent thunderstorm was tearing the sky apart. The thunder roared like a starving beast. Inside the dream, everything felt disturbingly real. He could feel the bone-deep cold of the wind and the sting of rain lashing against his face. Then, emerging from a wall of white spray, a figure appeared. It was a middle-aged man, immaculately dressed in an expensive suit and a refined hat. The kind of outfit one would wear to a lavish dinner party in the city, not for a stroll along the lake during a Category 10 storm. The man approached Benjamin. His eyes were wide, filled with terror and urgency. Not a single sound came from his mouth. But what he did next was what would haunt Benjamin for the rest of his life. The stranger reached out, seized Benjamin's hand, and shook it with astonishing force, almost violently. As he did so, he turned his body and thrust his free hand toward the open lake, where Superior was howling in fury. His gaze seemed to scream, "Look, something deadly is happening out there. Save them." Benjamin jolted awake. He sat upright on his bed, gasping for air, his hands still tingling as if someone had just squeezed him hard. He looked around the dark interior of the station and saw his fellow surfmen either sleeping soundly or quietly going about their duties. Everything was normal. Outside, Lake Superior lay smooth as glass. Not a ripple on its surface, let alone a storm. Benjamin tried to reassure himself that the dream was nothing more than the result of exhaustion and an overactive imagination. He was a real lifesaver, a man of action, not someone who believed in ominous signs or bizarre dreams. Yet something inside him refused to settle. The sensation of that handshake felt too real. It wasn't like the vague dreams that fade the moment you wake up. It felt like a memory that had just been made. He stepped outside to breathe in the cool air, trying to shake the image of the man in the suit. He walked down to the beach and spoke with the surfmen on the morning watch. "I had the strangest dream last night," he said half-jokingly, recounting the man and his silent warning. The others laughed it off. "Must be wishing you were headed to a party instead of another patrol, Ben," they said. "Look at the lake. It's calm as can be. Nothing's going to happen out there." Around midday the following day, as Benjamin and the others were resting inside the station, the door was suddenly flung open. A man staggered inside, his clothes torn, soaked through, and caked with sand. His skin was bluish from the cold, his body covered in cuts and bruises. He collapsed onto the floor, barely able to breathe. When Benjamin rushed to help him, the man managed only a few raspy words. "The ship, it sank. Out there, last night." The station erupted into shock. How could a ship have gone down within their patrol area without anyone knowing? The survivor explained that his vessel, the Western Reserve, had suffered a catastrophic accident far offshore beyond the line of sight from land. They had launched lifeboats, but the waves overturned them all. He was the only one who managed to swim for hours through the darkness to reach the shore. A massive rescue operation was launched immediately. Benjamin and his fellow surfmen headed out onto the lake in their rescue boats, scouring the water day and night. They hoped to find survivors clinging to debris, but all they recovered were 4 lifeless bodies drifting on the waves. The survivor insisted there had been 27 people aboard, including women and children. That meant more than 20 were still missing. Early in the morning of September 1st, after more than 24 hours of nonstop searching, Benjamin and a small group decided to patrol the shoreline, hoping some victims might have been washed ashore. As the faint light of dawn began to rise, Benjamin spotted 2 dark shapes lying motionless on the sand in the distance. He and his companions ran toward them at full speed. It was a man and a woman, lying face down, their faces buried in the sand. They had been dead for some time. Benjamin knelt beside the man's body. He placed a hand on the man's shoulder to roll him over for identification. In that instant, Benjamin felt his heart stop. As the face of the corpse was revealed in the morning light, a cold shock shot straight down his spine. It was him, the man from the dream. The same face, the same elegant suit, now ruined by lake water and sand. But the horror did not end there. As Benjamin completed the motion of turning the body over, the man's lifeless arm fell limply, and in a coincidence so chilling it defied belief, the corpse's icy hand dropped directly into Benjamin's palm. It looked exactly like a handshake, identical to the one from the nightmare 2 nights earlier. Benjamin stood frozen. He realized that at the very moment he had been asleep and trapped in that nightmare, the Western Reserve was being crushed by deadly waves. This man, later identified as Robert McH, one of the ship's owners, had truly appeared in Benjamin's mind during the final moments of his life. He had tried to shake his hand, tried to point out the unfolding tragedy, begging for help that Benjamin had dismissed as nothing more than a trick of the mind. Of the 27 people aboard the Western Reserve, 26 perished. Only one survived to tell the tale. Benjamin Trudel lived the rest of his life haunted by a single question. If he had trusted his dream that night, if he had convinced his fellow surfmen to launch the boats immediately while it was still dark, could he have saved Robert McH and 25 other souls? That handshake from the dead was more than coincidence. To Benjamin, it became a cruel reminder that the boundary between this world and the next can sometimes be so thin that a single touch, a warning from beyond the grave, is enough to alter the fate of an entire ship. But on that night, human skepticism prevailed over instinct, and Lake Superior kept all its secrets locked beneath its deep, cold waters. Have you ever wondered, the next time you dream of a stranger pleading for help, whether it is only a dream or a soul truly reaching for your hand through the darkness? What would happen if a ghost were the only thing capable of saving your life? On Pawleys Island, there is a legend known as the Gray Man. He does not emerge from the shadows. He appears in broad daylight, under blazing sun, only to vanish in the blink of an eye. To see him is to witness an omen of disaster. Yet the strangest part comes afterward. In the wake of devastating storms, amid fields of wreckage and splintered ruins, certain houses remain standing as if shielded by an unseen force. They share one eerie detail. Their owners encountered the being who does not belong to this world. Is it the protection of a restless spirit, or the price of a silent, unknowable pact? On the afternoon of September 20th, 1989, Jim Moore and his wife Clara were enjoying a leisurely walk along the shoreline of Pawleys Island, a ritual they had kept for decades. Pawleys is a peculiar place, less than 4 miles long and so narrow that it can barely accommodate a single main road, lined with homes pressed close to the beach on both sides. Jim and Clara were longtime residents, accustomed to the scent of salt in the air and the gentle ocean breezes that swept inland. Yet that afternoon felt different. Far out at sea, dark clouds were gathering, dense and heavy with menace. Jim had heard news reports about a storm named Hugo forming offshore, but like many seasoned islanders, they were inclined to dismiss the danger. They had weathered countless storms before, and this one, they assumed, would be no different. Still, something gnawed at Jim's attention. The beach was unusually empty. At that hour, people normally strolled along the shore or paused to watch the sunset, but today, it seemed their neighbors had packed up and evacuated early. As they walked across the smooth sand, Jim noticed a figure approaching them from the opposite direction. It was a solitary man. As the distance closed, an unease crept in. On an island this small, everyone recognized one another, or at least knew a familiar face, but this man was a complete stranger. He wore a long, ash-gray coat and a wide-brimmed hat that concealed much of his face. His pace was hurried, his head slightly bowed, as though avoiding something unseen. Wouldn't it strike you as strange to see someone dressed as if headed into a dusty old library, rather than enjoying the sea air on a deserted beach? When the man was no more than 10 feet away, Jim, polite by nature, called out, "Hello there. How's it going today?" His greeting was met with a chilling silence. The man in the gray coat did not look up, did not nod, or acknowledge them in any way. He passed by swiftly, like a true apparition. Irritated by the rudeness, Jim stopped and turned to look after him. That was the moment his heart seemed to stop. The beach was completely empty. Just seconds earlier, the man had brushed past them, yet now, on a long, flat stretch of sand with no trees or rocks to hide behind, he was gone. Jim urgently called to Clara. "Look, where did he go?" They stood frozen, scanning the rippling ocean, the houses perched above the shore, but there was no sign of life. No sound, no footprints leading anywhere. A chill settled over them despite the warmth of the late afternoon, a disappearance that defied all ordinary physical logic. Shaken and confused, Jim and Clara hurried back home. As soon as they stepped through the door, the television was broadcasting an emergency bulletin. Hurricane Hugo was no longer an ordinary storm. It had escalated into a catastrophic system, a powerful hurricane heading straight for Pawleys Island with destructive force. A mandatory evacuation order had been issued. The memory of the strange man on the beach surged back into their minds, but there was no time to dwell on it. They grabbed the most valuable belongings they could carry, jumped into their car, and raced toward the only bridge connecting the island to the mainland before the raging seas arrived. They took shelter at their daughter's house farther inland. That night, and in the days that followed, the family remained glued to the television, watching horrifying footage of Hugo's power. Towering waves swallowed homes whole. Violent winds tore through everything in their path. Reporters on the scene declared that Pawleys Island had been flattened, with hardly a single structure left standing. Jim and Clara were devastated. They understood that the home they loved, filled with a lifetime of memories, was likely nothing more than drifting debris scattered across the ocean. In their despair, their daughter hesitantly brought up the story of the man they had encountered on the beach. Her voice trembled as she said, "Mom, Dad, you might have seen the gray man." She went on to recount the legend of a young soldier from long ago who had ridden on horseback through the marshes to reunite with his fiancée after years apart. Tragically, he became trapped in quicksand and died a slow, agonizing death just before reaching her. Since then, before major storms, his spirit is said to return, wearing a gray coat and wide-brimmed hat, to warn people to leave. It is believed that anyone who sees him and truly heeds the warning will have their property protected, as a gesture of gratitude for trusting his message. Several days later, when the storm had passed and authorities allowed residents to return and assess the damage, Jim and Clara drove back across the battered bridge with heavy hearts. As they neared their neighborhood, the sight before them was nightmarish. Neighboring houses had been reduced to foundations, trees were uprooted, and debris was scattered everywhere. Everything lay in ruins. But when the car came to a stop in front of their own address, both of them broke down in tears of disbelief. Amid a flattened, lifeless landscape, Jim and Clara's house still stood, upright and intact in a way that made no sense at all. Even the flower pots on the porch remained untouched. Not a single window was broken, not a roof tile out of place, while sturdier homes nearby had been swept away without a trace. Their house looked as though it had never endured a storm. Can you accept a coincidence this extraordinary, or was there truly a force from beyond death that had raised an invisible shield around their home? To this day, the people of Pawleys Island still gaze toward the horizon whenever dark clouds gather, hoping, or fearing, to glimpse the figure of the man in the gray coat. The existence of the gray man remains an unsettling mystery, a strange intersection of death and compassion, reminding us that sometimes ghosts do not return to haunt the living, but to save those willing to listen to echoes from the past. That's going to do it for today's stories. If you enjoyed this video, please let us know by leaving a comment and telling us what you thought about these cases. Or if you have any theories of your own, I'd love to hear them. Thank you so much for your support, and until next time, we'll see ya.